I watched a child knock on my iron gate until her knuckles reddened, and I did not move. And a year later on Christmas Eve a red envelope slid under my study door like a verdict I had earned. I, Armin Qureshi, said, "Who is sending mail at midnight?" And the city answered with sirens and snow. I opened the envelope with a daggered letter opener and told myself this was theater, not confession. Then the paper breathed. Noor wrote in slanted blue ink, "Sir, my name is Noor and I am 9, and I ask for 2 things, shoes for my brother, and a kinder winter," and my mouth went dry. I said, "People ask me for fountains and towers, not winter," and the window threw back my face without mercy. Noor wrote, "I was the girl outside your gate last Christmas, the one with the red scarf," and my memory stood up like a witness. I said, "I told the guard to move the crowd, not the child," and the marble floor did not believe me. She wrote, "We counted your windows to keep warm," and numbers turned into stoves I had never lit. I said, "Farida, forgive me," and my late mother did not answer because the dead know when apologies are late. I set the letter down and heard the party below like coins spilling in a church. Noor finished her first page. "I will knock again this Christmas, slowly, so I do not wake the rich," and the room tilted until my glass whispered against the desk. I said, "I am awake," and the snow tapped the glass like a child's small hand, asking if truth is home. The party downstairs hurled music at my tower like confetti cannons, and I read Noor's line about purple feet, wrapped in newspaper, while the city wrapped itself in light that warmed no one. I said, "You cannot write purple into a grant," and the sentence tasted like rust. She wrote, "I tuck paper in his socks so the wind stops biting his bones," and I remembered Farida sliding yesterday's headlines under our door to muffle the draft when the heater died. I said, "Mother, I bought a building to bury that night," and the room pressed back with the weight of my own receipts. Noor asked for a pair of shoes and a different kind of winter, and I had 10 pairs asleep in a closet wide as her alley. I said, "Shoes are easy," and the letter answered, "Then why are his toes still stories?" I felt the marble tilt as if my floor knew shame before I did, and the glass kept showing me a man who had mistaken brightness for warmth. I said, "Farida, I forgot," and peppermint breath from childhood did not forgive me, because forgiveness is a currency that hates being late. The music swelled, the chandelier hissed with dust heat, and I folded the page with the carefulness of a surgeon closing a wound. I said, "1 pair, then 10, then every pair," and the snow ticked the window like a metronome counting down the debt. A soft knock tried to thread itself through the bass line, and Sophia cracked the door with a question balanced on her knuckles. Sophia said, "Sir, the board is waiting," and her eyes flicked to the red envelope, the way birds test a storm. I said, "Tell them winter can wait," and the words startled me because they sounded like a man I used to know. Sophia said, "They want you to toast the minister," and I pictured a glass raised over a city that had chewed its own lips to stay quiet. I said, "I will toast when his radiators sing," and she measured the risk like a tailor measuring a throat. Sophia is 30, Pakistani, hair in a tidy bun, suit black as a sealed secret, and she moved with the care of someone who keeps men from detonating their lives on Tuesdays. Sophia said, "Is this about that letter?" And I said, "It is about last Christmas," and the room cooled as if the window had opened. She nodded once, the small nod people give history, and she closed the door so gently that the latch chose not to speak. I said, "Visibility," and the word came back wearing new teeth. The party surged below, but it sounded lonelier now, like a chandelier singing to itself in an empty church. I turned to page 2, and Noor wrote, "A man in a gray coat told us to move, because the owner said the rich cannot feel pity if we are too close." My stomach went tight like a fist closing over a coin. I said, "I never said pity." And the marble echoed, "You said visibility," because stones remember briefings better than men. Last quarter I had presented a slide titled Perimeter Strategy, and the graph rose like a skyline built from the backs of beggars. I said, "We meant crowd flow," and Noor's blue ink slid the word off the table. She wrote, "We only wanted the heat from the bakery vent," and I remembered choosing scent profiles for the gala, while a child learned cold by heart. I said, "How long does cold take to name a person?" And the window gave me back my age faster than math. I pictured the gray coat, the livery crest, the nod that makes kindness illegal for the night. And I wanted to fire my own mouth from last December. I said, "Words are fences when men are clever," and the chandelier blinked as if ashamed of its brightness. Noor ended the line. We moved slow and no one ran after us, and I tasted the iron in the phrase, "no one." Postmark on the envelope was last year's December 24th, and the stamp leaned left as if even glue knew uncertainty. Noor wrote, "If I write neat, they will listen," and I ran a thumb over each careful letter like a blind man learning his own sins. I said, "Neat will not fix our noise," and the air refused to carry the line for me. She wrote, "I will come again on Christmas Eve and knock slow, so I do not wake the rich," and the sentence put its small hand on my chest. A rumor I had ignored uncurled in memory about a girl in a red scarf found asleep and not waking 2 blocks from my heated curb. I said, "Rumors are truths that wore thin shoes," and the city exhaled a cold answer. The chandelier stilled as if light could hold its breath, and I felt older than my own biography. I said, "Rahim will remember," and the phone in my pocket turned heavy like a stone that wanted water. Noor's last neat line ended without a flourish, and I realized she trusted paper more than doors. I said, "I will open," and the snow tapped the window twice like a reminder that time keeps receipts. The letter lay on marble with shadows like prison bars, and I understood that I had built the cell and the key and the silence. I grew up above my father's tailor shop, where rain rattled the tin roof, and my mother said, "Arman, if hunger knocks, open before it learns to pound." I swore my doors would open only to me, and in time they did. Then I forgot to listen for knocking. Noor's words reached for a part of me that still smelled of wet cloth and kerosene lamps. I remembered sitting cross-legged on the counter, watching my father's needle dance while monsoon water crept under the door. My mother would roll up her sari hem and block the flood with threadbare blankets, humming songs that made the rain less cruel. Back then we were poor, but not unreachable, because neighbors called each other beta and uncle, and no one's door stayed shut for long. I said, I traded a neighborhood for a fortress, and the study's silence felt like iron around my voice. Noor's plea carried the same rawness as those nights, and I knew I had wrapped my life in insulation thick enough to muffle the human sound of need. I looked at the letter again, wondering when I had started believing that wealth could keep the cold out without freezing something inside. I made my first million, converting a derelict warehouse into glass-front condos, and my first enemy, by evicting a mother with a baby from the top floor. The numbers worked like scripture, and I told myself I was merciful for leaving the baby's blanket. Tonight Noor's words twisted that blanket into a noose around my concept of holy. I remembered signing the eviction order without hesitation, then celebrating over champagne while the woman dragged her life into a taxi. The baby's wail had echoed through the stairwell, but I treated it like the sound of pipes rattling. Now, years later, I saw that moment for what it was. A choice dressed up as inevitability. My office walls were lined with awards praising urban renewal. But renewal for whom? Noor's quiet request for shoes and warmth made those plaques feel like tombstones with my name on them. I said, I built light into the skyline but shadows into the streets, and the room seemed to lean away from me, as though ashamed to be my witness. Halfway down the page Noor wrote, I know your name, Uncle Arman, and the word uncle landed heavier than any title I had bought. In the neighborhood I grew up in, we called everyone's elders, aunt or uncle, a simple word that carried shelter inside it. Somewhere between the tailor shop and the penthouse, I lost that vocabulary. Noor's handwriting was deliberate, letters spaced like footsteps she couldn't afford to misplace. I pictured her dipping her pen slowly, making each stroke neat so I'd believe her worth the ink. Uncle, in her sentence, was not just a courtesy. It was a bridge thrown over the cold air between us. I said, Uncle Arman, out loud, and the sound scraped against my throat. The study smelled faintly of cedar and polish, nothing of cumin or cardamom like the kitchens I remembered. That single word from her letter, felt like an invitation to step back over the threshold I had closed for decades, and I realized I had no idea how to cross it without tearing my shoes. Noor told me she watched the lights on my tower at night, and imagined each window as a stove keeping someone's bones warm. She counted them to fall asleep, turning my skyline into her lullaby. The thought struck deeper than any market loss. I had lit those windows for optics, for investors, for the gala photographers. But to her, they were proof that warmth existed somewhere above the street. I said, "You counted my windows the way I counted monsoon leaks," and the words hung heavy between me and the glass. I leaned on the window frame, looking out over the city I thought I owned, realizing it had never really belonged to me. In her mind, my tower was a giant hearth. In reality, it was a monument to my own insulation. I felt the weight of every empty heated room in the building, rooms that could have been shelter, but instead sat as status symbols in the sky. She wrote, "I am not angry, but my brother coughs like a little engine, and his toes look like old grapes. I think shoes will stop the purple." The description was so vivid, I could almost hear the engine sputter in the cold. My chest tightened, shame catching like a cough of its own. I said, "Shoes. Yes, shoes," as if speaking the word could conjure them instantly. I glanced toward my walk-in closet, knowing 10 pairs of hand-stitched leather sat there in the dark, untouched, each one polished for events I no longer attended. The contrast was obscene, a boy's bare feet in the street against my curated rows of Italian craftsmanship. Noor's request was not wrapped in bitterness. It was practical, almost transactional. That made it harder, because she wasn't asking for charity, just a tool to keep her brother's feet from becoming a season. I felt the heat of the room suddenly unbearable and stood, but the cold outside seemed like the only honest temperature left. Pain grew louder with every line. Noor described men in my company's livery jackets shooing her and her brother away from the bakery vent because the smell offended a visiting investor. I sat down hard, as if my own body rejected the idea. The words aroma and offended had become shackles on a child's lungs, and I could hear the metallic click of them in my head. I said, "Who taught me to hate the smell of bread?" And the question echoed against glass and marble like a thrown coin. In the letter, she added, "We only wanted to sleep where it was warm," and that sentence weighed more than any blueprint I'd ever rolled out on a boardroom table. I pictured the scene, steam curling into the night, 2 children holding onto each other like rope, and my brand stitched into the jackets that turned them away. The guilt felt like frost creeping under my collar, and for the first time in years, I wished I could trade the architecture of my empire for a single unlocked door. She wrote, "We don't beg, we trade stories for coins. I tell the one about the crow who stole the sun, and my brother claps." The image burned in my mind, her words turning the street into a stage, while I kept my own stories locked in conference rooms. I remembered commissioning a sculpture of a crow in black onyx to sit under my skylight, a symbol of vision for my corporate lobby. Now, it felt stolen from her. I said, "I stole the sun and put it under glass," and the truth landed heavier than expected. In Noor's telling, the crow carried light so no one had to sleep cold, not so it could be admired by men in suits. I wondered if she told the story with the same precision as her letter, every beat timed to win a coin. I could almost hear Hamza's small hands clapping, the sound sharp against the night air, defiant against hunger. The letter shifted. "If you read this, it means the post did not lose me, and that is already a good thing." I learned that Noor and Hamza were migrants from a floodplain swallowed twice in 2 years. My company's riverside billboards promised waterfront forever, and the irony cracked through me like ice breaking. I said, "Forever for whom?" under my breath, though the room heard it anyway. I saw the images in my mind. Their home gone to water, a boat crammed with families, and above it all, my grinning promise of permanence. The kind of permanence money buys for those who already have it. Noor didn't mention the flood except in passing, but the weight of it pressed between every line. Her calm about survival made my own comfort feel like theft. She wrote, "My mother used to clean an office like yours," and she said the man had kind hands before he had a tall building. My breath caught. The name in my memory matched. Noor's mother Razia had once cleaned for my mother when we still lived above the tailor shop. I remembered her bringing sweets for Eid, her hands smelling faintly of soap and cardamom. I had not thought of her in years, and now here she was, stitched into this letter. I said, she knew me when I was still reachable, and the truth stung more than the memory. Somewhere in the years of contracts and towers, I had stopped being that boy who shared chai with the cleaning staff. Noor ended the page. I will come again on Christmas Eve. I will knock slow, so I do not wake the rich. The postmark told me this was last year's letter. Memory added the street rumor, a girl in a red scarf found asleep, never waking, 2 blocks from my heated curb. My throat closed around air too cold to breathe. I said, I built warmth that never left my property, and the glass fogged with my breath like it was ashamed of me. The sentence never waking nested in my head, laying eggs of guilt that would hatch into years. I thought of Hamza alone in some corner of the city, his small cough still measuring the cold. I set the letter down with the care you'd give to a fragile truth. And in the silence, even the snow seemed to pause mid-air, as if waiting for me to answer a question I had ignored for 12 months. I called Rahim, my driver, at 12:10 a.m., and he answered with the careful tone of a man paid to manage another's moods. I said, last Christmas, do you remember a child? Silence stretched like a rope between us. Then Rahim said, yes sir, I remember 2 children and a red scarf. His voice carried the weight of something he'd folded away for too long. I closed my eyes, seeing the scene without needing his words. The air in my study grew heavier, as though the truth itself had walked in uninvited. Rahim's admission cracked open a door I'd nailed shut in my head. The image of them at the gate burned brighter than the city lights behind me. I said, and then, but part of me already knew. The letter felt hotter in my hands, as if Noor's ink had been waiting for this moment to speak louder than both of us. Rahim told me the guard moved them on and they sat by the bakery. Later, a patrol came for a loitering complaint. Hamza coughed. Noor wrapped him tighter and Rahim said, I wanted to bring them hot tea, but orders were strict. I said, my orders were a wolf that wore a tie. The silence on the line agreed with me in full. I imagined Rahim holding a thermos in the dark, its heat trapped inside while children shivered a few meters away. My own policies had turned my staff into stone statues dressed in uniforms. The thought landed heavy. I had designed rules that rewarded distance and punished compassion. That winter my instructions had teeth. Tonight, their bite was mine to carry. I took the private elevator down, the kind that opens onto velvet carpets and champagne flutes. The party was in full bloom. Gold dresses, sharp tuxedos, laughter polished to a shine. I walked through with Noor's letter in my hand like a holy relic. Mrs. Khan from Pia intercepted me with a blade smile. Sir, the minister is here, she said, tilting her head toward a circle of officials. Tell him winter can wait, I said, and kept moving. The crowd parted just enough for me to pass, murmurs rising in my wake. The chandeliers above scattered light like broken glass across my path. In their glitter, I could see the faces of the board, my partners, my allies, all about to become witnesses to my refusal. My pulse pounded against the envelope. I had no intention of stopping until I reached the street. The snow hit my face like clean slaps. I told Rahim, take me to the bakery on Hazrat Lane. He drove fast, and guilt made the ride feel shorter than breath. The bakery's steam was already ghosting into the night. A woman in a wool cap ladled broth into paper cups, her breath fogging in rhythm. She saw me before I stepped out, her eyes taking in my coat, my shoes, my hesitation. The way she looked at me made my tie feel like a shackle. I asked, do you know of 2 children, a girl and a boy? She didn't answer right away, just filled another cup and handed it to someone behind me. Then she said, yes. The word landed with the weight of a headstone. The volunteer handed me a paper cup, her fingers rough from work. You're late by a year, she said. She told me Noor was found the morning after Christmas, still warm but gone. Hamza was taken to a shelter with toes wrapped like little cocoons. My throat burned. I asked, "Where is he now?" She said, "Tell yourself why you're asking." Her gaze held mine until I had no answer fit for the air between us. The soup in my hand steamed upward, carrying scents of lentil and cumin, scents I'd left behind decades ago. I realized the cup weighed less than the truth she had just given me. At the shelter, the supervisor led me down a narrow hallway lined with cots where children breathed like fragile engines. She said, "Hamza is in the corner by the heater." I followed her gesture and found him, small, bundled in an oversized sweater, bandaged toes sticking out from a blanket. He was asleep, clutching an empty shoebox to his chest as though it were a pet. The heater hummed beside him, a sound warmer than anything I'd heard in my penthouse. I stood there, unsure if stepping closer would wake him or break something in me. "I brought a thing a year late," I whispered, and the air in the shelter seemed to absorb it without judgment. The supervisor waited silently, as if she had guided many men to such moments and knew words were wasted here. I wanted to place the letter beside him, but it felt too heavy for his small hands. I knelt, the floor pressing its cold into my knees, and watched his lashes flutter in the heater's glow. He murmured, "Noor, tell the crow story," without opening his eyes. I said softly, "I'm sorry, little engine," but he sighed and drifted deeper into sleep. That sigh carried more trust than I deserved. My hands hovered above his blanket, unsure if comfort from me would be welcome. I stayed like that for a long moment, the hum of the heater and the distant shuffle of the shelter blending into something that almost felt like a lullaby. In that stillness I understood why Noor's letter had waited for me. It was not only to tell her story, but to place me here, in this room, with a choice I could not outsource. The supervisor returned with an envelope. "She asked us to hold this in case you came," she said. My name was written in the same straight, careful letters. I took it, feeling the weight of a second chance wrapped in paper. I, who had never arrived second to any deal, had arrived second to a child's death. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal, more afraid of what I might read than of any loss I'd faced in business. The paper inside smelled faintly of something sweet, maybe the bakery vent she had written about. It was folded so small, it seemed made for a secret, not for a man like me. Inside was a drawing of a pair of shoes, shaped like little boats. Above them she wrote, "If you cannot give us winter without teeth, then give my brother shoes without holes. If you cannot give us a house, then give us a window that does not forget us." Beneath the words, she had drawn a square window with a smiling face. My throat closed, and my vision blurred until the lines of her drawing shimmered. I had designed towers of glass that reflected the city, but never a window that remembered the people outside. I started crying, quietly, almost stubbornly, as if I could keep the sound from waking her absence. I stood, wiping my face with a sleeve that felt unworthy of the task. "Buy him shoes." "Buy them all," I told the supervisor. She replied, "Money is a ladder, climb down first." Her words hit harder than any boardroom challenge I'd faced. That was the moment I knew what I had to do. Go back to the tower and burn the paper crown I'd worn for decades. The letter went into my coat pocket, over my heart, heavier than my wallet had ever been. I walked out of the shelter into the night, the snow falling thicker now, as if the city had decided to cover everything at once. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and guarded tempers. Men who could feed 100 families with their cufflinks waited for my explanation. "You're late for the winter gala pledge," one said. I placed Noor's letter on the table like evidence. "A 9-year-old wrote me a better manifesto than our mission deck," I told them. Mrs. Khan from PR whispered, "Careful, sir." I said, "Careful is how people freeze politely." Their eyes shifted between each other, calculating damage. I had spent my life speaking their language, percentages, returns, optics. But tonight I spoke in heat and hunger. My pulse thudded in my ears. Someone asked, "Is this about optics?" I said, "Yes, finally, optics. The kind where you can see your own breath and understand what that means for someone with no walls." "I'm liquidating the Winter Lights sponsorship," I said, "and moving the funds to year-round heating centers." A short laugh came from the far end, sharp and dismissive. I kept going. Turn the tower lights off for 1 hour tonight, in memory. An older director said, "It'll look bad." I said, "That's the point." I signed the order in front of them, my pen scratching like a fuse being lit. Every stroke on the paper felt like burning one of my own portraits. The silence afterward was brittle, ready to snap. I knew it wasn't approval. It was the pause before retaliation. They voted to censure me. Then they voted to remove me, if I didn't reverse course. "Persist," I said, my voice steady. "You'll lose everything," someone warned. "I've already lost a year," I answered. I gathered Noor's 2 envelopes and slipped them into my pocket. For decades I'd left boardrooms with deals sealed. Tonight, I left with nothing but paper and a strange sense of lightness. The corridor outside felt longer than I remembered, the carpet swallowing my footsteps. At the stroke of 9, the tower went dark. The city gasped, first in confusion, then in a hush that felt almost sacred. People looked up from their screens as though someone had called their names. I stood outside with Rahim, handing out coats and shoes we'd bought in a rush. He looked at the unlit skyscraper and said, "I've never seen it this beautiful." "Me neither," I said. In the dark silhouette, I saw what the building could have been all along. A shelter, not a monument. Snow clung to my hair and didn't melt. I didn't wipe it away. Back at the shelter, Hamza shuffled in new shoes that seemed to lift him off the ground. Each step was a small drum beat against the tile. He grinned at me, missing a tooth, and said, "Noor will like these." I failed to hide the wince that rose in my face. He looked at the dark tower through the window and said, "It's sleeping." Yes, I told him to dream different windows. His laughter was brief but bright, like a match catching in the cold. I found myself holding on to that sound more tightly than any applause I'd ever received. Morning came thin and gold, stretching over streets still wearing last night's snow. News vans lined up outside the shelter, their cables like vines crawling toward the door. My PR called to say, "The minister is offended by the blackout." I sipped tea from a paper cup a volunteer had given me and said, "Let him wrap himself in his offense. It's warmer than nothing." She warned, "You'll be ousted by noon." I said, "Then noon will be honest." The steam from my tea curled into the air, mixing with the chatter of reporters who hadn't noticed they were blocking the shelter's entrance. I moved past them, their microphones a forest I had no interest in walking through. The city looked different in daylight, less like glass and more like bone. By midday my badge and parking spot were gone. They could take those, I still had Noor's letters. I walked to the bakery on Hazrat Lane, where the owner, a round man with flour on his sleeves, recognized me instantly. "We should have done more," he said. I told him, "We will." We built a bench outside his shop, bolted a small heater to the wall, and set a wicker basket labeled "Spare Socks" under the window. People paused, some taking socks, some leaving them. It wasn't grand, but it was the opposite of invisible. Watching the steam from the heater mingle with the scent of fresh bread felt like the first blueprint I'd drawn that didn't need a scale. I went to Noor's place, the quiet square of earth beneath a young sapling in the municipal cemetery. The ground was hard with frost, but the tree's thin branches shook gently in the breeze. I read her second envelope aloud, my voice catching on certain words. A man passing by looked at me oddly, a rich man speaking to dirt, but I didn't stop. I imagined she could hear me through the soil, or maybe through the part of me that had changed because of her. The sapling's leaves flicked like small green ears listening. When I finished, I stayed there, letting the wind do the talking. Her note was folded so small it seemed almost shy. Inside she had written, "If you read this, please do not cry long. Listen for other knocks. Doors get lonely when they never open." I folded it back carefully and placed it in my wallet, where my money used to go first. The red thread from her scarf clung to the leather seam, a reminder that not all debts are paid in cash. I stood for a long while, the cold pressing its hand to my back. The wind moved through the sapling's branches with a sound like fingers tapping on wood. That night, I sat cross-legged on the shelter floor, surrounded by children. Hamza insisted, I tell the crow story. I told it badly, and the others laughed, correcting me. They added that the crow carried a stove in its beak this time. When the lights flickered overhead, I heard a soft knock somewhere in the shelter's wooden frame. It was nothing, maybe the wind, maybe the building settling. But I answered anyway. "I am here," I said into the dim, and for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a lie.